Imagine spending millions of dollars and years of highly intensive R&D to build a massive patent portfolio around your core software product.
Right. You deploy your legal team, you secure all the paperwork, and you basically prepare to shut down your biggest competitor.
Exactly. And then the U.S. government steps in and just burns your entire legal strategy to the ground. And not by doing some crazy external research, but simply by holding up your own company's engineering blogs and historical filings to prove that your quote-unquote novel architecture is actually completely derivative.
It is honestly the ultimate nightmare scenario for any technical leader. I mean, the very documentation you created to establish your dominance in a given space, it ends up being the exact ammunition used to invalidate your market position.
Welcome to today's deep dive. If you're listening to this, you are likely a CTO, an engineering leader, or a technical founder. You know, you spend your sprints managing scalable architecture, trying to minimize technical debt, and figuring out how to ship product without breaking production.
It is hard enough on its own.
Exactly. But today, we're auditing a different kind of architecture. We're looking at your intellectual property strategy. We have this fascinating, completely real-world case study playing out right now in the gaming industry. But the fundamental lessons, they apply to every single tech stack, SaaS platform, and enterprise software company out there.
Yeah, because what we're looking at today is a scenario where the standard legacy playbook for protecting software innovation didn't just fail to work. It actively, catastrophically backfired.
It's wild.
It really is. The underlying mechanics of this failure expose a massive vulnerability in how modern engineering organizations handle their IP.
So our mission today is highly specific. We are going to deconstruct a massive legal and technical paradox. We are looking at the United States Patent and Trademark Office, the USPTO, and their stunning non-final rejection of all 26 claims of Nintendo's U.S. patent number 12,403,397.
The infamous summon and fight patent.
That's the one. It's been dominating tech news. We are going to explore exactly how a multi-billion-dollar tech giant had its own prior filings weaponized against it.
And we are just going to recap the news cycle here.
Yeah.
We want to surgically dissect the underlying algorithmic logic and the legal frameworks of this rejection.
Which brings us to our core thesis for today's deep dive. We are taking a strong, unambiguous stance right out of the gate. Broad software patents are a massive liability.
Absolutely.
They are a liability for legacy incumbents trying to build a moat, and they are a liability for early-stage startups trying to impress VCs. By the end of this conversation, you will understand exactly how to pivot your IP strategy depending on your company's growth stage, so you don't fall into the same trap that Nintendo currently finds itself in. Okay, let's unpack this.
So to really grasp the magnitude of this structural failure, we have to look at the timeline. And specifically, the legal mechanisms that were triggered here.
Yeah.
Because the speed of this collapse is just unprecedented.
Right.
Nintendo filed this specific patent application in March of 2023. Fast forward to September 2nd, 2025, and the USPTO officially grants it.
And they don't just put it on a shelf. I mean, the ink isn't even dry before Nintendo, along with the Pokemon Company, weaponizes it.
Oh, instantly.
They simultaneously push a massive patent infringement lawsuit in the Tokyo District Court against Pocket Pair. That's the developer of the breakout hit game, Palworld.
Right, so from the outside, it looks like a textbook execution by a legacy incumbent. They're asserting dominance over a broad umbrella concept. Essentially, the foundational gameplay loop of aiming an item, catching a digital entity, and summoning it to a specific spatial coordinate to engage an enemy state machine.
But the ink wasn't just dry. The paper it was printed on essentially caught fire.
Exactly. Just weeks after the patent is granted, in November 2025, the narrative completely inverts. USPTO Director Johnny Squires steps in, and he personally orders an ex parte reexamination of the patent.
Okay, I want to pause right there, because for a CTO or an engineering VP who deals with patent counsel occasionally, the phrase ex parte reexamination might not immediately set off alarm bells.
Sure, sounds like standard legal jargon.
Right, but in the context of patent law, and specifically the Lee-Smith-America Invents Act, this is a massive administrative flex. Usually, if a patent is challenged, it's done through an inter partes review or an IPR.
Let's draw that distinction, because it's critical for understanding the gravity of the situation. An inter partes review and IPR is an adversarial process. It's litigious.
Okay.
If Company A gets a patent, Company B can file an IPR with the Patent Trial and Appeal Board to challenge it. Company B acts as the adversary, bringing prior art, taking depositions, and just fighting it out. It's incredibly expensive and time-consuming.
So in a normal world, Pocket Pair would have spent millions filing an IPR to defend themselves against Nintendo's patent.
Right, but exactly the opposite happened.
Oh.
The ex parte reexamination means the USPTO is looking at it internally.
Right.
Ex parte translates roughly to from one party.
Wow.
And what makes this specific instance so wild is that usually, even an ex parte reexam is requested by a third party submitting a formal document saying, hey, USPTO, we think you missed this prior art.
But there was no formal request here, right?
None. There was no formal request from Pocket Pair or any external company triggering the U.S. action.
So Director Swires just looked at the situation, determined on his own authority that, quote, substantial new questions of patentability have arisen, and just pulled the ripcord himself.
He did. The sources note this is the first time since 2012 that a USPTO director has personally initiated this kind of review without an external company's official involvement.
That is over a decade of precedent broken just to drag the specific patent back into the light.
Yeah, and we have to consider the context of why a government official takes that kind of unprecedented action. When the patent was granted in September, there was massive public and professional outcry within the tech and legal communities.
I remember seeing that.
Yeah, IP lawyers like Kirk Sigmund publicly called the approval an embarrassing failure of the U.S. patent system. Florian Mueller, who's a well-known IP expert, stated Nintendo never should have received the patent.
They were getting torn apart online.
Exactly. The USPTO was facing a severe credibility crisis for allowing a company to seemingly patent a software architecture that literally every developer instantly recognized as ubiquitous.
Which brings us to the ultimate paradox of this entire situation. The patent goes back to the Central Reexamination Unit. And in April 2026, the examiner issues a non-final rejection of all 26 claims.
The entire architecture is just dismantled.
Completely. But here is the most humiliating part for Nintendo from an engineering strategy perspective. The examiner did this without ever looking at a single line of competitor code and without ever booting up a video game.
They didn't boot up Palworld. They didn't look at Elden Ring or Persona or any other game that utilizes companion AI state machines.
So what did they look at?
They relied strictly on published patent applications, what we call prior art. And the majority of the most damaging prior art came from Nintendo's own historical filings.
Let me push back on that for a second, because this is where a lot of technical founders get confused. If a company invents something, say in 2019, and then refines it in 2023, why wouldn't they patent both?
It seems logical, right?
Right. How does a legacy incumbent with world-class lawyers make the mistake of letting their own historical documentation cannibalize their current intellectual property? I mean, isn't it just their fiduciary duty to patent every iteration of their software?
It's a great question, and honestly, it exposes the siloed nature of large engineering organizations. Yes, software is iterative, but patent law demands novelty.
Okay, novelty.
Under Section 102 and Section 103 of the U.S. Patent Code, an invention must be new, and it must not be obvious based on what already exists. Large organizations often treat patents as volume metrics.
Like a KPI for the R&D department.
Exactly. They treat them as KPIs rather than precise strategic tools.
So let me get this straight. The engineering team in 2019 files a defensive patent just to hit their quota for the quarter, and the legal team in 2025 doesn't realize that that 2019 filing fundamentally undercuts the massive offensive litigation strategy they are currently building.
That is the exact structural failure. When you try to cast a massive broad net over an entire software concept in 2025, you inevitably overlap with your own foundational work from 2019.
You're tripping over your own feet.
You really are. You're essentially telling the patent office, hey, we invented this entirely novel system architecture today. And the patent office just opens their own database, pulls your file from 5 years ago, and says, no, you documented the core routing logic for this half a decade ago.
Wow.
It's not novel anymore. It belongs to the prior art landscape now.
So they tried to double dip on their own concepts to create a more effective weapon against a current competitor, and instead they handed the USPTO the exact ammunition needed to shoot the whole thing down.
Beautifully stated.
And understanding exactly how the examiner constructed that ammunition is crucial for any technical leader listening. Because the USPTO didn't just find one old document that magically invalidated all 26 claims, right?
No, not at all. They performed a highly analytical, surgical teardown of Nintendo's software architecture by stitching together multiple disparate pieces of prior art.
And that teardown relied heavily on Section 103 of the Patent Code, the standard of obviousness. For our listeners building out complex back-end systems or game engines, it is vital to understand how the government determines what is obvious.
Let's transition into that technical autopsy. Because as a CTO, you really need to understand how these claims are constructed and, more importantly, how the logic is dismantled.
Let's do it. Let's look at the system architecture Nintendo was actually trying to protect in those 26 rejected points.
So let's strip away the game terminology for a second and look at the bare metal mechanics. At a high level, the patent describes an information processing system, a storage medium, and a method of execution.
Okay.
The core mechanic claims a sequence where a player entity, which possesses a transformer location and rotation in a virtual 3D space, receives an input from a client. That input triggers the instantiation or summoning of a subcharacter entity to a specifically calculated coordinate.
Right. So we are talking about spatial coordinate calculation, input handling, and entity spawning. You press a button, the engine calculates a vector, checks for valid nav mesh locations, and spawns the prefab.
Yes, but Nintendo went further to claim the state-machine logic that follows the spawn. Once the subcharacter is summoned, the system runs a proximity check. Is there an enemy entity's bounding box within a defined radius of that spawn coordinate?
And if it finds one?
If the Boolean returns true, the subcharacter's AI state automatically shifts to an automated battle mode. If false, the state shifts to an idle or automatic movement mode where it just follows the player.
And they also claimed a secondary input layer, right? Like if the subcharacter is already spawned, the player can provide a second distinct input to command that subcharacter to move to a new spatial coordinate.
Exactly. And again, the system runs the proximity check and shifts the state to combat if an enemy is present.
So they tried to build a fence around that entire logic flow across 26 highly specific interlinked claims.
They did. And that extreme specificity, trying to patent the exact Boolean checks and state transitions, that's where the USPTO examiner went to work using that obviousness standard we mentioned.
Which brings us back to Section 103. The examiner has to prove that the differences between Nintendo's 2025 claims and the existing prior art are such that the invention as a whole would have been obvious to a person having ordinary skill in the art.
Right. Which patent lawyers abbreviate as FASITA.
FASITA. Okay. So for our purposes, think of FASITA as a standard, competent, senior software engineer.
The examiner essentially argued that a competent senior engineer, given the existing documentation in the industry, would naturally arrive at Nintendo's architecture without requiring any inventive leap.
Because all the building blocks were already there.
Exactly. And to prove this, the examiner created this sort of Franken-Pryor art combination. They didn't rely on one source. They stitched together 4 specific historical patent references to prove that every single component of Nintendo's state machine was already documented.
Let's walk through those 4 references because this is a masterclass in how prior art research is conducted. The first one is called the Taura reference.
Right. Taura is a patent filed by Nintendo itself around 2019 and granted in 2020. It's named after the lead inventor on the filing.
Okay.
This document explicitly covered the core foundational system of summoning a subcharacter to fight alongside a player character.
So right out of the gate, Nintendo's own R&D department undercuts their 2025 litigation strategy.
Pretty much. The examiner used the Taura reference in the rejection arguments for all 26 of the claims in the new patent.
Unbelievable. The USPTO is basically saying, you already established the underlying framework of this system years ago. You don't get a new 20-year monopoly just because you want to sue Palworld today.
But Taura alone wasn't enough. Taura had the broad strokes, but they didn't specifically detail the intricate state-machine transitions between automated and manual commands that Nintendo was claiming in 2025.
Okay, so to invalidate those specific claims, the examiner had to look outside of Nintendo.
Enter the second reference, which is the Yabe patent. And this is where the history of software architecture gets really fascinating.
Oh, I love this one.
Yabe is an incredible pull by the examiner. This is a patent granted to Konami all the way back in 2002. We are talking about the PlayStation 2 era.
The PS2.
Yes. The architecture of the PS2, the emotion engine, it had severe memory constraints compared to modern hardware. But the Yabe patent described a highly efficient logical system where companion characters had 2 distinct battle states.
An auto mode and a manual mode.
Exactly. One where they act autonomously, which is the auto mode, and one where the player gives them direct manual target orders.
Think about the implications of that for a modern software team. Nintendo, in 2025, is trying to claim the invention of an AI entity that seamlessly switches between an autonomous combat loop and a manual override loop.
And they get blocked by Konami.
Right. The USPTO USPTO points to a Konami document from over 2 decades ago and says Konami already documented the dual auto-manual finite state machine architecture when we were still using memory cards.
It's wild. It proves that while the hardware running the code has evolved exponentially, the fundamental algorithmic logic of state transitions was mapped out decades ago.
Wow.
So now, the examiner has Nintendo's Taura patent for the summoning concept and Konami's Yabe patent for the state machine logic. But they still needed to invalidate the claims regarding how these entities move and position themselves in a 3D environment during these transitions.
Which brings in the third reference, Motokura, which is another cell phone by Nintendo.
Yes, Motokura was a Nintendo patent filed in 2020 and granted in 2022. This specific filing dealt heavily with the mathematics of how characters are positioned, rotated, and moved within a 3D space during gameplay transitions. It covered the spatial data handling.
So let's look at the mathematical formula the USPTO examiner is building here to destroy this patent.
Quite a stack.
It really is. They take Nintendo's Taura patent from 2019 to cover the base summoning system. They add Nintendo's Motokura patent from 2020 to cover the 3D spatial transformation data. And they add Konami's Yabe patent from 2002 to cover the dual auto-manual behavioral state machine.
And by combining the logic of those three disparate references, Taura, Motokura, and Yabe, the examiner successfully proved that 18 of Nintendo's 26 claims were obvious.
That's the majority of the patent gone right there.
Yeah, claims 1, 2, 5 through 7, 10 through 14, 17 through 19, and 22 through 26 were completely invalidated just on that three-part combination.
But the examiner wasn't done. Nintendo had 8 remaining claims that dealt with the highly specific granular logic of how the engine determines the exact coordinate where a summoned character should materialize relative to the player's current velocity and position.
Right, they needed a missing link to dismantle that specific spatial logic.
And they found that missing link in the Shimomoto reference.
They sure did. This was a patent granted to a completely different competitor, Bandai Namco, in 2020, originating from a 2019 filing.
Bandai Namco.
Yep. The Shimomoto patent detailed the specific algorithmic logic. Essentially, the raycasting and offset calculations used by a game engine to determine valid spawn coordinates for a summoned entity relative to a player character's transform.
So the algorithmic logic that calculates the safe spawn point, checks the nav mesh, and prevents the entity from spawning inside a wall. I mean, Bandai Namco already had that documented on the books.
Exactly. And by applying Shimomoto alongside the other 3 references, the examiner invalidated the remaining 8 claims, a 100% total rejection of the entire architecture.
It is a devastatingly thorough teardown.
Devastating is the right word.
But let me play devil's advocate here, because if I am Nintendo's legal counsel or if I am a CTO looking at this precedent, I am screaming about the methodology.
Oh, absolutely.
We are talking about the Graham factors of obviousness. If a government examiner has to stitch together 4 entirely different patents sourced from 3 completely different rival corporations, spanning more than 20 years of software history, just to prove that an invention is obvious to a competent engineer.
Wait, isn't that extreme complexity actually proof that the invention isn't obvious?
It's a very fair point.
Right, like if it takes a forensic archaeologist to put the puzzle pieces together, how could it be obvious to a standard developer in 2023?
That is the exact defense strategy known as fighting hindsight bias. And it is absolutely the argument Nintendo will make in their formal response to this non-final rejection.
Hindsight bias.
Yes. In patent litigation, hindsight bias is when an examiner looks at the completed, patented invention, the picture on the puzzle box, and uses that picture to go hunt through decades of archives to find the individual pieces that fit.
Like you only knew to look for the 2002 Konami state machine because you saw we used a state machine in 2025. Precisely. The legal standard requires the examiner to prove that a standard engineer in 2023 would have a motivation to combine those specific historical documents without knowing the final outcome.
And Nintendo will say there's no way they would.
Right. Nintendo will argue vehemently that there is no logical reason a developer building a modern spatial engine would naturally look at a 2002 PS2 architecture patent, combine it with a 2020 Bandai Namco raycasting patent, and merge it with 2 distinct Nintendo AI patents. They will argue the USPTO's combination is entirely artificial.
But here is the problem with that defense, even if it's legally sound. The examiner anticipated it.
They absolutely did.
The USPTO didn't just provide one path to rejection. They provided 2 separate invalidity arguments for every single claim. Even if Nintendo successfully argues that merging Konami and Bandai Namco is an unnatural combination, they still have to defeat the alternative prior art combinations the examiner built.
And that is why this is a non-final ruling. Nintendo has 2 months to respond, with options to extend, and they will likely appeal this all the way to the federal circuit. The legal battle is far from over.
But the very fact that the USPTO went to such extreme, convoluted lengths to invalidate this patent proves our core thesis today. Trying to monopolize broad software mechanics puts a massive target on your back.
It really does.
It forces regulatory bodies and your competitors to dig through decades of documentation to find a way to break your claims.
Which leads us directly into why this is such a critical existential liability for modern engineering organizations. This isn't just a quirky story about video game mechanics and old PlayStations.
Right.
This is a stark warning about how fundamentally brittle broad software patents truly are, and how attempting to weaponize them can paralyze your own product development.
Let's expand on that real-world impact. Let's look at the broader context of the Palworld litigation, because the consequences of IP strategy aren't just theoretical debates happening in a courtroom. They dictate the actual JIRA tickets and sprint planning of your engineering teams.
To really understand the impact, we have to look at what Nintendo actually demanded when they filed the lawsuit in the Tokyo District Court. They weren't asking for a licensing fee.
No, they wanted blood.
They demanded a full injunction against Pocket Pair, which would block Palworld's continued distribution entirely. And they demanded damages, specifically 5 million yen each for Nintendo and the Pokemon Company, plus late payment fees.
Now let's contextualize those numbers. 5 million yen is roughly $32,000 USD. For companies generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, a $64,000 combined penalty is a rounding error.
It's nothing.
It's less than the cost of the lawyer's billing for the afternoon. But the injunction, the legal threat of having a judge force a developer to pull their game offline or fundamentally alter their shipped production codebase, that is the real weapon of a broad software patent.
It's the threat of mandated technical debt. And we saw Pocket Pair react to that threat in real time. To mitigate their legal risk while the lawsuit played out, they had to surgically alter their live software.
They actually changed the game.
They did. In November 2024, they released a patch that completely removed the ability to summon pals by throwing the PalSphere items the exact mechanic targeted by the patent. Then, in May 2025, they pushed another update that fundamentally altered the physics and input logic of how players glide in the game.
Just put yourself in the shoes of Pocket Pair's CTO for a second. Your platform is a massive, historic hit. You break concurrent user records on Steam and Xbox. Your CEO is publicly stating the company can barely manage the influx of revenue.
A great problem to have.
Right. And instead of your engineering team building new features, scaling the backend, or optimizing the netcode, they are spending their sprints ripping out and rewriting the foundational core gameplay loops, the exact mechanics your user base loves, because of a looming legal threat based on broad concepts from a competitor.
It is the ultimate nightmare for a product team. Regression and technical debt imposed entirely by external litigation. Pocket Pair was very transparent about this, stating explicitly in May 2025 that they were forced to make these technical compromises specifically to avoid disruptions to the distribution of the game.
But this highlights exactly why Nintendo's strategy, using broad patents as a blunt instrument to bully a competitor into altering their product, is fundamentally flawed. And I will argue this directly to our listeners right now. If you are a technical founder or a VP of engineering, and your legal strategy relies on securing broad software patents to create an impenetrable moat around your platform, you are operating under a dangerous, false sense of security.
Legacy organizations view these broad patents as indestructible shields. They operate under the delusion that if they patent the high-level concept of, say, dynamic load balancing for video streaming, they suddenly own the entire genre of video streaming.
Right.
But in reality, overly broad software patents are the most brittle structural weak points in an entire business plan.
Hold on, why are they uniquely brittle? If I get a patent for a mechanical engine part, it's pretty solid. Why is software different?
Because software is uniquely, relentlessly iterative. Almost nothing in modern software architecture is truly completely novel from the ground up.
That's true.
We are all building on top of open source libraries, established design patterns, and decades of computer science theory.
Mm-hmm.
If you try to patent a broad concept like routing data efficiently or managing a distributed ledger or a character state machine, you are claiming territory that has almost certainly been explored before.
When you claim a broad concept, the surface area for prior art is just massive. The USPTO's teardown of Nintendo proves this perfectly. If a competitor or an annoyed government director looks closely enough at a broad software patent, they will find the prior art to invalidate it.
They absolutely will.
They will find an obscure GitHub repo from 2012, or an academic white paper from an MIT symposium in 2015, or a Konami PS2 patent from 2002 that executed a vaguely similar logical flow.
And when that happens, what is the ROI on your patent strategy? The R&D time you spent documenting it, the millions in legal fees you spent prosecuting it, the years you spent defending it, it all instantly evaporates. Your paper fortress gets dismantled.
Just poof, gone.
Gone. And the worst part is, while you were distracted building and defending that fragile legal construct, your competitors were utilizing their capital to actually ship better, faster code.
It effectively weaponizes the open ecosystem against you. Instead of protecting your proprietary innovation, a broad patent practically dares the global tech industry to crowdsource your invalidation. And as we saw with the massive public outcry from IP lawyers regarding Nintendo's filing, the technical and legal communities are highly motivated to point out when a corporation overreaches and tries to claim ownership of basic architectural patterns.
So if the legacy playbook is dead, if trying to monopolize a broad concept like summoning a digital entity or dynamically scaling a microservice gets you laughed out of the patent office and destroyed by your own historical filings, what is the actual path forward?
That is the crucial question. If I am a CTO managing a scaling engineering organization today and my board is demanding I protect our intellectual property, how do I build a strategy that doesn't create a massive hidden liability?
This is where we need to translate the failure of Nintendo's legal war chest into a concrete, actionable playbook for your own tech stack. And the most important thing to understand is that your strategy must completely flip depending on the growth stage and capitalization of your company.
Okay, let's break this down into two distinct tactical phases: the pre-Series A founder and the scale-up.
Sounds good.
Let's start with pre-Series A founder. You are running a lean team, you are burning venture capital, you have developed a novel piece of back-end technology, and your seed investors are grilling you on what your moat is. You absolutely need some form of IP protection to secure your next round of funding. What is the play?
If you are a pre-Series A, your absolute imperative is hyper-specificity. You must file highly narrow, incredibly detailed technical implementations.
So really getting into the weeds?
Exactly. You do not attempt to patent the concept of what your software achieves. You patent the exact, highly specific algorithmic logic, the unique mathematical formulas, or the highly proprietary data structure you engineered to execute it.
Wait, if I patent something super specific, doesn't that make it easy for a competitor to just change one line of code and bypass my patent entirely?
It does make it easier to design around, yes. But a narrow patent actually survives scrutiny. Let's use a system architecture analogy. It is the difference between trying to patent the abstract concept of a load balancer, which gets you instantly invalidated because round-robin DNS has existed forever, versus patenting a highly specific, proprietary least connections routing algorithm that uses real-time biometric telemetry to optimize edge compute distribution.
Ah, I see. The broad patent gets destroyed in an ex parte reexamination in 2 months. The hyper-specific algorithm patent is actually defensible because the implementation is genuinely novel.
Exactly. If Nintendo had focused their 2025 patent solely on a highly unique, deeply technical rendering pipeline for exactly how the memory is allocated when a character materializes, rather than the broad gameplay loop of throw item, check proximity, fight Merkinid, they might actually have a defensible patent today.
That makes total sense.
For a startup, narrow patents serve their primary purpose. They prove to investors that you have proprietary technology, and they prevent a legacy incumbent from directly copying your exact, optimized code base line for line.
Okay, so pre-Series A, go narrow, go deep into the math, protect the specific algorithm. But what happens when you graduate? You hit Series C, you have product market fit, you have hundreds of engineers, and your team is starting to invent broader architectural systems that dictate how your entire platform operates. Your surface area is huge. How does the CTO's strategy shift?
For scale-ups and enterprise companies, your strategy must invert entirely. You shift away from aggressive offensive patenting, and you pivot heavily into aggressive defensive publication.
Defensive publication. This is a concept that is gaining massive traction in elite engineering circles. Explain the actual mechanics of how a software team executes this.
Defensive publication is the act of intentionally, systematically putting your broader inventions into the public domain to legally establish them as prior art.
Okay.
If your engineering team invents a broad concept, say, a radically new way to manage state, across a globally distributed database cluster, do not send it to the legal team to file a broad, brittle patent. Instead, you publish it.
You open source the foundational mechanics.
Yes, you open source the core abstraction layer on GitHub. You have your senior staff engineers write incredibly detailed, highly technical architecture blogs on your company website explaining exactly how the system works. You send your lead developers to major conferences like AWS Re.Invent or KubeCon to present white papers on the findings.
So you are intentionally creating a massive, highly visible, permanently time-stamped paper trail.
Precisely. You are using open publication as an offensive weapon to salt the earth around your product. By establishing robust, undeniable public prior art, you make it absolutely impossible for a legacy incumbent like an Oracle or an IBM or a Nintendo to ever patent that space around you in the future.
Let's play that scenario out. Say I'm a mid-sized sauce company and I publish an engineering blog on a new data routing concept. 2 years later, a massive tech conglomerate tries to file a broad patent, claiming they invented that routing concept, and they plan to use it to sue me. What happens?
The conglomerate files the paperwork. But because your engineering blog has been crawled by Google, indexed by the USPTO, and cited in developer forums, the patent examiner finds it immediately.
They don't even have to look hard.
Nope. The examiner doesn't need to stitch together 4 obscure patents from 20 years ago. They simply pull up your time-stamped blog post, attach it to a rejection notice, and instantly deny the conglomerate's application under Section 102 for lacking novelty.
You essentially neutralize the legacy company's ability to build a patent army before they even draft the paperwork. You protect your own freedom to operate by ensuring that no one else can ever claim monopolistic ownership of the broad architectural concepts your platform relies on.
Nintendo's current humiliation is a perfect textbook illustration of what happens when an organization fails to understand this dynamic.
Yeah.
They tried to build a high legal fence around a massive generic plot of intellectual land using a broad patent. But because that land was already densely littered with prior art, including the foundations they laid themselves, the fence was torn down by the regulatory authorities.
It is a profound paradigm-shifting lesson in technical leadership. As a CTO, you have to know exactly when to build a highly specific, deeply narrow wall around your most valuable proprietary algorithms, and when to simply pave the road and make it public so nobody else can ever charge you a toll to drive on it.
And executing that strategy requires constant, high-friction communication between your engineering leadership and your legal counsel. The lead engineers need to be trained on what legally constitutes prior art, and the patent lawyers need to be forced to understand the exact, granular technical bounds of what the engineering team is actually compiling.
Otherwise, you get the Nintendo situation.
Exactly. If those two departments operate in silos, you will accidentally overreach, contradict your own history, and expose the entire company to a devastating re-examination.
Let's summarize the key actionable takeaways from today's deep dive. We started by looking at a stunning, almost unbelievable legal paradox. Nintendo, attempting to aggressively enforce a broad summon and fight software patent against the developers of Palworld, had their legal war chest spectacularly dismantled by the U.S. government.
And the mechanism of that dismantling is what really matters here. The USPTO examiner, acting under a rare unilateral directive from the director, rejected all 26 claims of the patent.
Okay.
They didn't do it by looking at the modern gaming market. They did it by relying strictly on the legal standard of obviousness. They stitched together a 2002 Konami PS2 patent, a 2019 Bandai Namco spatial logic patent, and 2 of Nintendo's own historical R&D patents to prove the entire architecture was fundamentally unoriginal.
It was a massive strategic failure that proves our core thesis. Trying to monopolize broad software mechanics in the modern era is a dangerous trap. For the engineering leader listening right now, the playbook is clear. If you are early stage, narrow your filings. Protect hyper-specific algorithmic implementations, the biometric least connections router, not the concept of a load balancer.
And if you are scaling up, pivot to aggressive defensive publication. Open source your broad concepts to salt the earth and prevent legacy incumbents from fencing you in.
Protect your specific execution and democratize the broad abstractions to ensure your own freedom to operate.
In a software landscape defined by rapid iteration, it really is the only sustainable way to navigate intellectual property.
Which brings us back to where we started. We talked about how you expect your intellectual property strategy to be a secure fortress, only to realize that the blueprints you absent-mindedly left in the public library 5 years ago were used by the inspector to condemn your building today. So I want to leave you with a final lingering question to mull over with your legal counsel and your lead architects in your next sprint planning meeting.
I love this question.
If an unprecedented director-level USPTO intervention can completely dismantle a multi-billion-dollar tech giant's legal war chest using nothing but their own historical paperwork, what hidden catastrophic liabilities are currently sitting dormant in your own company's technical documentation and patent portfolio right now?